you all hear me back there? Yeah? Okay, hi everyone! How's your day been so far? I see a thumbs up, I see some nods. It's 3 o'clock. I know it's that time of the day, so I'll try and be a little more energetic than normal. I just had another cup of coffee. I'm only on number 7, so I think we'll be okay. I may have taken the last cup of coffee from the urn. I apologize. So we're going to talk about Ruby and sentiment analysis. What's love? What's hatred? What's anger? What's joy? What's sadness? What's it got to do with it, right? Creative title. But before we get started on that, a little about who I am. So as mentioned, my name is Ben. I'm a second career developer. Any other second career developers here? Any bootcamp people, second career developers? Yeah, bootcamp! Woo! So I spent a decade as a rabbi and a community organizer throughout the U.S. You move around that often, either if you're working in the military or in the clergy. So I was in the latter. I lived in San Diego, New York City, Boston, and Denver. So I've seen a lot of different expressions of sentiment and the ways people express their sentiment and emotionality in the U.S. And I now live outside Tel Aviv in Israel. And I am a developer advocate at Nexmo, the Vonage API platform. We have a suite of cloud communications API platforms. You might have seen my stickers I've been throwing around on the tables and coupon cards. We have a great Ruby gem. I maintain it. I think it's pretty awesome. And so that's a little about who I am. What are we going to do today together? So we're going to do a few things. We're first going to take a bit of a high-level approach and trying to understand why this entire conversation matters. Why is it important that we even examine the contours and sort of the shape of human language? Why should we even invest the time in that? So to do that, we're going to take a little bit of an adventure into linguistics, into the nature of human language, a little bit of a detour from coding and more into a different type of coding, the coding of our thoughts in the ways in which we speak to each other. And then from that, we're going to talk about another balcony perspective around what is natural language processing? What is happening? What are the rules that inform the algorithms that perform those tasks? And then as a subset of that, what specifically is sentiment analysis? And then we're going to say, well, now that we know what these things are, what can I actually do with it? What can I build with it that can give me some insight in the world that we live in? And lastly, we're going to build it, because that's what we're going to do together. We're going to build something, and then we're going to run it, and then analyze the data and understand, well, what comes back to us from these analysis, and take a deep dive into that actual data that we get back. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay, so let's actually get started with that big question. That huge question, why does this matter? Why should I not just walk out of here and get smart candy from the sponsor out there? Why should I actually focus on, and they're Valentine's candy, by the way, so they're pretty good. But why should I actually focus on this subject? So to answer that question, we actually have to start with a pretty big claim. And that claim is that language, human language, is not only a passive vehicle for information. And what I mean by that is that language is more than the conveyance of point A from person X to person Y, a pure transmission of data. Language has to be something more than that. Language itself shapes the ways in which we think. It shapes the ways in what we think we ought to think about, if that makes sense. And I'm going to give you just a couple quick examples before we get into the rest of our conversation together. So one example is what might happen as a typical water cooler conversation between you and your panda friend, and you're standing around the water cooler and you say to your panda friend, last night I had dinner with someone, it was delicious. Pretty simple English sentence, right? Not so complicated, not super uber complex. I had dinner with someone, a human being, and that dinner, because what's the it in that sentence? The dinner, right? The dinner was delicious. What I'm choosing to reveal, because as an English speaker, what I'm choosing not to reveal is guided by the rules of the language that I'm employing, right? So another example, that exact same sentence in a language you might not even know what that is. What is that? That's not Klingon. That is Hebrew. And so Hebrew, like many other languages in the world, German, Italian, Russian, French, etc., 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 do things a little differently. So that sentence would say, and I'm going to read it for you in English, last night I had dinner with a male someone, and she was delicious. Why do I need to do that? Because what do many languages in the world have which English does not, and used to, by the way, in the evolution of English, but no longer does? Gender, masculine, and feminine assignments for proper named entities, right? So dinner, arucha in Hebrew, is a feminine word. There is no such thing as it. You can't say something is an it. It is either a he or a she. So I'm referring to the thing by not referring to it by its named entity. I had to say that she was delicious. Furthermore, there is no such thing as a someone. What is a someone? You are a male someone or a female someone. There is no non-gendered person. So in that way, I, in the water cooler talk, have to actually reveal to my Panda colleague the gender identity of the person that I had dinner with. That may or may not be more or less than I wanted to tell that person. Because nuance there, right? Suddenly things might shift if I say I had dinner with a female someone or a male someone is different than just saying a someone. Because the rules of the language, again, change the contours of what we have to actually think about. And one last example is how we see ourselves in the world. Our place in the world, our literal physical selves. So if I were telling you how to get to the coffee shop down the street from the McWane Science Center, and I'm a speaker of English, I might say something to you like, you go out the door, past the popcorn stand on your right, and don't buy any popcorn because it's not good for you, and then make a left, and then another left, and then a right, and it's right in front of you. That sounds pretty reasonable, right? But if I speak a language that thinks of myself and all of us in a different context as far as where we're situated in the world, I will say something like, you go out the door, go north, then take a west and another west, and then it's southeast, and it's right there in the southeast corner. And the people who speak those languages actually at all times understand the cardinal directions around them. Where north is, where east is, where west is, where south is. And a great example of that would be if I take my index finger and I point to in this way, and I just correct myself because it's so obvious, I point in this way, what am I doing? I'm pointing to myself. Pay attention to me, I'm over here, everyone look, I'm over here, I'm here. If you're a speaker of one of these geocentric languages, what are you doing when you point this way? You're pointing through yourself. You're pointing to the cardinal direction behind you. And this is all to say that language does more than convey information. Language helps shape the way we understand and see the world. Language itself is a medium, it's a tool that helps us think about what we ought to think about and how we ought to think about how we ought, that's on English, how we ought to think about things. Because language is ultimately a conduit constructor, and understanding language helps us in understanding the world that we live in. If you think about our world as a society, as a human society, it is shaped by the words that we are inundated with. The words that I create, the words that you create, the words that we all create together. And understanding those words helps us understand the world we live in. And algorithms, natural language processing, can help us in getting to that level of understanding. So then, my friends, what is natural language understanding? What is this tool that we have in front of us? And as a subset of it, what is sentiment analysis? So to answer that question, we turn to Alan Turing. People familiar with Alan Turing? The Turing Test is something really intelligent. Is it thinking or not? Alan Turing prophesied. Did you know he was a prophet? I didn't know either. He prophesied that by 1999, what year are we in now? 2020. By 1999, we would look at the two words, machine and thinking, the juxtaposition of the two, and not see a contradiction between them. We would look at a machine, we would look at this MacBook, this beautiful MacBook with that touch bar, which is kind of annoying, and you would look at that machine and you would say, that machine thinks. Are we there yet? That's the question. Are we there yet? Because what does it mean to think in a human context? You can imagine thinking in many different contexts, but within a human context, you can imagine that thinking is understanding the ambiguities, the nuances, the complexities, the contradictions of human language. So you can understand the ways we understand ourselves. If you can understand the ways we understand ourselves and understand others, you might be able to articulate the idea that you are thinking. It's not the only way to assess thinking, but it is one possibility. So within natural language analysis, let's take that sentence that we had before. Last night I had dinner with someone, it was delicious. And this is a sample of the data that you would get back from a natural language analyzer on that sentence. You would get back things like the sentiment score, the semantic roles, the key words, emotional scoring, and categories, right? So under semantic roles, we see the analyzer was able to identify that the subject was I, that the sentence is able to pick out and see the full continuous sentence, the object was dinner, the verb was have, and it was conjugated in the past tense. I had dinner. Therefore, my key words in this very complex sentence, were last night and dinner. Last night primarily and dinner secondarily, tertiary. Right? Now, my primary intention is telling you what I did last night, and secondarily what I did was I had dinner. I went to the food hall, it was really good, and then I went home. That is essentially what's happening in this analysis. So how do we actually process that? How do we get to that kind of data? We get to that data by employing a bunch of different rules from English language, from languages in general, structures. So for example, so things like formal grammar, inflectional ending. So for example, if the police, does this make it work? No, okay. If the police helps dog, is it working? Oh, it's working, yay, it's so cute. Police helps dog bite victim versus police help dog bite victim. Very different intentions between those two things. Inflectional endings really matter as part of the rules. That's great. Was that worth the wait? That was worth the wait, right? That was really good. Inflectional endings, parts of speech tagging, parsing sentences, the root forms of words, taking the relationships of named entities of who to whom, what to what, and the different probabilities of the meanings of any particular word. Because any one word in many different languages can mean different things, depending on the context, and the algorithm needs to score the likelihood of the different probabilities of that meaning to really understand that sentence. So all of these things, and there's so many more, come into play when trying to understand and analyze human language. But that's understanding human language vis-a-vis things like its semantic roles, the grammar, the objects, the categories. How do we get to things around polarity and things around sentiment analysis? We get to that by trying to then understand the emotionality of a sentence. And one of the primary tools to understand emotionality is a concept called polarity. Polarity really means, right, what does polarity mean? The extremes between two things, right? And so happiness, what's the extreme of happiness? The other extreme, tired? I don't know. Happiness, sadness, anger, joy, things like that. And so the algorithms have to be trained to understand the polarity in a sentence as well. So I'm going to give you 3 examples in order of difficulty of understanding the polarity, and you can help me score these things. So the first example, I dislike broken cars. What's the polarity if I dislike broken cars? What's the scoring? It's probably a little angry, upset, discontent. I dislike broken cars. It's easy. That's super easy for an algorithm to process the polarity of that. Let's take another example. I really truly love going out in this weather. What's the polarity of that? Well, it could be one of 2 things. It's sunny outside, it's a beautiful day, let's go see the Vulcan statue, it's amazing. I really truly love going out in this weather. Or, I really truly love going out in this weather? It's raining outside, you don't want to go outside, it's gross. You know, in Tel Aviv, if it rains, the entire city shuts down. You don't want to go out in that kind of weather. And so, that's sarcasm. How does an algorithm understand sarcasm? Does anyone know? What's the primary understanding of sarcasm? Context. What is sarcasm except for its context? That's what defines a sarcastic comment, context. Because when it's written, you can't get the inflectional endings, right? You have to get it from its larger context. And the last one, which really just throws us for a loop every time, is the following. I love my mobile. This is written for a British audience, so cell phone. I love my mobile, but would not recommend it to any of my colleagues. What's going on there? I love my cell phone, but I wouldn't tell you to get it. What's the polarity? What's the scoring of that sentence? Is it a happy sentence and I'm really joyful, I got the new Google Pixel phone and it's amazing? Or is it, oh my gosh, I got the Google Pixel phone and I like it, but you would, not for you particularly. You're an iOS person. You stick with iOS. And so, like, where does it come from? Well, the problem with sentences like that is that they are contradictory. And the problem for algorithms is how to score contradiction. And that, my friends, yields a huge issue. Because this may come as a huge shock. It came as a huge shock to me, I'll tell you this. People are contradictory. We make contradictory statements. We don't always make sense. I know that's like outlandishly crazy that we don't always make sense, but we don't. And so if we want to understand human language and understand the sentimentality of human language, we have to actually understand paradigms like that, where they are utterly contradictory. So now that we have a bit of a balcony perspective, I really mean a balcony there because he's so much more, he spent an entire day on natural language processing. Let's think about what we can build with it. So what we can build with it, I'm gonna be a little self-interested, and we're gonna build something that would help me. Anyone else, like, am I the only one who, first thing I wake up in the morning, I check my phone? Does anyone else check their phone? You can admit it, it's a safe space we're in right now. I see one hand way up there. Everyone else, your hand should be up. I know you are. And so when I check my phone, what do I see on my phone? I see news headlines. And they can be really overwhelming, those news headlines. A lot of words. And I just want to know, is it safe to get out of bed? Is it safe to get out of bed? Or should I pull up the covers for another hour and retreat from this crazy world? That's the only question I have in the morning. Do I have to? Well, honestly, as a parent, I have to get up. I don't have a choice because, school and lunches and all that stuff. But do I have to get up or do I not have to get up? Because you just want to know, what is the mood of the news? So that's what we're going to build together, a mood of the news application. And we're going to build this as a WhatsApp application, so the user is going to send a topic that they're interested to see whether they should pull up the covers or not. That topic will then be scoured of all the news headlines of the day on that topic. We'll take all of those headlines, send them for a NLP, natural language processing analysis and sentiment analysis, and then send it back to the user through WhatsApp. And we're going to build this as a Rails application. Sound good? Okay, so let's do this. So let's build it. How do you say get her done, right? Let's get her done, right? That's what we say here. Okay, get her done. So we're going to use 3 APIs to do this. In the spirit of what you can possibly learn from this, maybe you learned a little bit of linguistics and you haven't thought about that before. Maybe you've never worked with an API, or you're working with external APIs. Maybe you haven't built a Rails application that really doesn't have any views and only works about with data transmission and working with data. Different things that hopefully will be for you interesting in this, and you can pick out of it what is most interesting for you in this talk. So we're going to be working with 3 external APIs: the News API, IBM Watson Natural Language Analyzer, and Nextmo Messages API. So the News API will let us scour all those headlines. The IBM Watson, there's other services as well, Azure, Google Cloud, we're using Watson, and Nextmo, there's other services as well. I can't say who they are, but you know who they are, that also offer you opportunities to send multi-channel communications. The Messages API is actually, I think, really cool. With just one bit of JSON, you can basically send communications, the multi-channel communications like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp. In Europe, they use things called like Viber. You ever heard of Viber? You know Viber. Viber and all these other things. And you can send it all, which is basically specifying the type in a JSON object. It's pretty cool. And I like all these 3. One of them because they pay me. The other 2 because all of them because they have a generous free access tier. They all have a Ruby SDK, which I think is critical to get up and running. And documentation. So important. Good documentation is the tipping point of whether I will use it or not use it. And so they all have good documentation. So the first thing we need is obviously our gem file. Our gem file has a few dependencies. We're going to use the Nexmo Rails gem, which the Rails initializer basically wraps around the Ruby SDK, provides you a globally credentialed instance of the SDK. We're going to use the News API gem, the IBM Watson gem. We're going to store our credentials in a .env, so we're going to use the .env Rails gem, and then we're going to include a little bit of emojis because we like them. Who doesn't like emojis? So we're going to use like some emoji parsing for fun. Why not? And then of course we also need our routes. Routes are very important. In this application, we only have 2 routes because we're not serving any views. We're just basically 2 post routes for webhooks. Webhooks are basically a way of getting data from an API without having to ask for that data all the time. So like in the traditional way, you'd be like, API, you have data for me? No. 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 A webhook is like setting up the route. You set it open to listen, and the API says, oh, by the way, I have data for you. Here you go. And so it's a much cleaner way to interact with APIs. You basically say, you contact me when you're ready. And I don't need to be reaching out to you every 5 seconds. You let me know when you're ready. I mean, you need 2 routes, one for inbound webhook and one for status updates, and they're going to reference methods in a news controller we're going to create in just a moment. And then, of course, we also need environment variables. Very simple. We just need a place to store our API keys and API secrets, and then along with our Nexmo application ID, it's basically saying we have this application called a news application, and we create it in our dashboard, and so we need an ID, and we store that as well, and our provisioned virtual phone number for our WhatsApp messages. Because WhatsApp requires you, unlike SMS in the United States, I think, don't quote me on that, in many countries, WhatsApp requires you to have an actual phone number to send and work with WhatsApp. So you need, and that's a very complicated process, by the way, to get a WhatsApp phone number. It's annoying, but that's one of the reasons why WhatsApp is not full of tons of spam, right? Because of that process. And then now we're going to go into the bulk of our work together, which is the controller. There are many different ways to have coded this. I am doing it, and this is full disclosure, the most simplest way, which is to put it all inside the controller. We could have abstracted this out to some model methods and all kinds of fun stuff. I know, Sandy Metz is here. She's like the genius on these sort of things. This is just all in the controller. It's just to get her done. And so it's in the controller, and we basically need to define a few methods. One is an inbound method to reference the inbound route, and the other one is the status method to reference the status route. All we're going to do with the status method is we're going to put out those params as they come in the updates to our console so we can see them, and we are going to then return back to the API HTTP status code of 204, no content, basically saying, it's your way of saying back to the webhook, I got the data. Thank you. You don't have to keep on sending it to me. Many APIs, if you don't acknowledge the data, will keep on doing what? Sending it to you over and over and over again until you acknowledge you received it. So that's very important. It's kind of like rote at this point. Just say, I got it. Thank you. Even if you don't need to, just say it. It doesn't hurt. And so once we have the status method, we can move on to the inbound method. The inbound method is essentially going to do 2 things. The inbound method is going to take the data that comes back from the API, assign it to variables so we can use it and work with it. And it's also going to then take that data that's been assigned to variables and pass it to a method that we have not yet created that will take those variables, that data, and pass it to the news API to get those headlines, and then send it to the sentiment analysis and natural language processor to analyze them. So we want the topic. What's the topic? The topic is the message that the user sent from their WhatsApp message. If you're building this as a real-time production application, I'd recommend you validate that data. You make sure the data is what you think it's going to be. That's keeping you pretty open there. But this is just a sample. I'm trusting myself, basically, to not try and hack myself. But I guess I could theoretically do that. And then the analyze headlines method, which is going to take parameter to topic and the recipient number, pass that in to the analyze headlines method, and again return a 204. Within the analyze headlines method, this is where the work starts. So we're going to create this analyze headlines method that's going to then take as arguments that topic and the recipient number. And the first thing we need to do is actually instantiate an instance of the IBM Watson gem, right? We need to instantiate an instance of that. I'm following, basically this code right here is following what's on their documentation. because I figure if I'm going to use something, I'm going to just follow what I say to do with it. And if it works that way, great, then I can play with it. If it doesn't work that way, then maybe raise a PR in the documentation, right? And say, like, what's going on here? Your documentation didn't match what you said it would do. And we basically say, okay, we want an instance of the NLU, the natural language understanding analyzer. We have to pass in our API key, which we've been storing in our environment variable. And and this is me figuring out where to put the single comma or whatever it's called, the single thing. And then we have to pass in a version date. This date I don't work for IBM, this date must have been seminal in the history of IBM. 2018, November 16th, I don't know why, but that's the date for all time. Something happened there that was huge in 2018, November 16th, that's their API date. And we also need to specify the endpoint, because I'm on the free tier, so I created my account, FYI, on a work trip in Amsterdam, and so I'm tied to the London endpoint. So wherever I am in the world, it may not be the fastest endpoint to reach, but I'm now tied to the one closest to Amsterdam, which is the London endpoint, even though London's not part of Europe as of today, but whatever. And then so we specify that URL, and now we've done that, we can now call the analyze method, which is an instance method of the gem. We're going to take that data that we get back from the analyze method, and we're going to store it in our beautifully named response variable, right? Very easy to know what it is. And we want basically to analyze the text. What is the text? The text is what comes back from a method we need to create called get news headlines, which will do what? Get news headlines will do? It will get the news headlines. Oh my gosh, you're all geniuses. And we want certain data points back from the analysis. You can specify as much of the data you want back or as little of the data that you want back. And we're basically saying, give us the entire room full of data. Give us everything. I want all the entities identifications. I want the keywords. I want the sentiment scoring. I want the categories, and I want with the categories explanation. Oftentimes the explanation is a bit redundant, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a repeat of the category, but every once in a while you actually get a little more insight. And I also want the relations between things, and I want the semantic roles, like what's the verb, what's the conjugative form that the verb is being used in, all that kind of stuff. And then of course I also want the emotion. What's really cool about the emotion, by the way, is you can specify either I want the emotional scoring on the entire thing I send in, or I'm going to say I only want the emotional scoring on these specific strings of text. So I'm going to send you this entire thing. I'm going to send you War and Peace. But I only want the emotional scoring on the word the. Give me the emotion on the word the. I might tell you that the word the doesn't have a high emotional scoring. But in this case, I'm saying I want the entire emotional scoring, the entire document, and I'm calling .result on that, which basically says just give me in like beautiful JSON formatted data that I can play with. And then we get it, and that's the result. And then the last thing we need to do is actually just get the news headlines. This is relatively straightforward. It's a method that takes in the topic. We instantiate an instance of the news API, and we pass in our API key, and we say, I want the news on that topic for everything, and I want it only for today, because I'm only interested to get out of bed today. I don't care what happened yesterday. I only care what happening today. And I did this intentionally. There's different ways to sort it. I want to sort it by popularity. Why do I want to sort it by popularity? What do you think? What's the impact of sorting it by popularity? You're allowed to talk. In Israel, we interrupt each other. It's fine. Why do I want to sort it by popularity? Because what am I interested in? What's the question I'm trying to answer? What's the mood? And what shapes the discourse of the mood? The number of eyeballs that see something, right? The more it's visible, the more it's prevalent, the more it's pervasive, the more it's shaping the mood. I can sort this by ascending or descending order, alphabetized. I can sort this in all sorts of ways. I just want to sort it by mood, by number of eyeballs, because that's what I'm actually interested in. It comes back as an array. IBM Watson doesn't like arrays, only likes strings, so I make it into a string, and then I explicitly return it. I like explicit return, so I always do an explicit return, get my data, I know what I have. And then the last step we need to do is to send that message. That's a lot of text. I don't expect you to read it. I'll send you the GitHub repo at the end. That's basically calling this HTTP call to the Nextmo Messages API, saying, okay, I have my URI, I want to use SSL. It's a JSON application type. My authorization is a JWT token, which we still need to generate. I generate a JWT token. And my body it's the from, it's a type of number of WhatsApp. The number I'm sending it from is my WhatsApp number. The to number is the recipient number. And then the message is the message that it's composed there. Thank you for contacting Mood in the News. Here's your scoring on the topic you're interested in. And last but not least is, of course, the JWT token. We generate that using the Nexmo SDK, passing in our application ID and our private key, and we get back a JSON web token, which is what we use for authorization to make the HTTP call. And then now we're ready to actually just give it a go. Ready to give it a go? Let's give it a go. So what are we going to call for? We are going to ask for programming. What's the mood of the news for programming? What do you think? What do you think? It's negative. The overall sentiment on programming is negative, but look at the emotional scoring. You see that? Can you see that on the side screen over there as well? Look at the emotional scoring. What do you see? 55% of joy and 46% of anger. So, but what's the number one emotional score? Most prevalent, joy. And yet, what's the sentiment? Negative. This is lesson number one that I had to learn. Emotional scoring and sentiment scoring are not exactly the same. They use different data points and they're examining it, and we'll actually see what that is in a moment. So we look at this and we're kind of bewildered. We think we're friendly people. I look at you, I see you, you've got a great beard, you're a friendly person. I look at you, you're a friendly person, we're all friendly people. Why is it negative? I want to understand the negativity. Let's address it together. Let's get in the room. We need like an Oprah moment. Let's hash it out. And so to understand that, we have to examine our data. Because as developers, we want to understand, what did we actually send to the API? What was the data we sent to get that score? It might not be what you think it was. So these are the headlines we sent to get that score. I'll read just a couple of them for you. IBM, Microsoft, and medley of others seek support for Google against Oracle in Supreme's Java API copyright case. And you go down a little bit further and you see John Wick TV show is moving along. And that's a lot of shooting probably in that show. And then you go a little further down and you see things like Sherman, 49ers turnaround. Win Improvement has put team in exclusive company, which is good news if you like the 49ers. And iOS 13.3.1 public beta 2 is back after a long hiatus. So when we look at these headlines, what we understand is actually that we have 18 headlines. 7 of them are related to the topic we were most interested in, which meant that 38.8% of our sample directly related to the topic that I cared about when I was waking up in the morning, which tells us we always need to examine our data, right? We're asking for something, we think we know what we're getting, we're actually not getting exactly what we think we're getting. But we are getting 38.8% of what we think we're getting. So that's the big point there, is to examine your data, check your assumptions. Don't assume what you're asking for is what you get. Now, furthermore, if we then take a little bit of a dive into the actual analysis of that data, well, as we mentioned, the sentiment was negative, with a score of negative 0.62, and the emotional results were 55% joy and 46% anger, with some other things in there as well. So why the discrepancy between those two things? Why do we have that seemingly big discrepancy between a negative sentiment and yet 55% positive emotion, with a close second of not such a positive emotion? So to understand that, we need to take a look at what were the concepts identified. Remember that in the initial data we looked at, that I had dinner with somebody last night sentence, and it came back that last night and dinner were the key concepts that we talked about? Well, in that data set, the key concepts identified were the following top 4. Board of Directors, Richard Sherman, Chairman, and then finally API, right? Now, if you remember the headlines, I don't expect you to remember them, so I'll tell you. A lot of them were actually talking about something tangentially related to programming. These 38.8% of them were talking about it. But what were they talking about vis-a-vis programming? The business of programming. Lawsuits about Java and boards of directors, people leaving companies, different kind of things like that. So in that overall context, the sentiment of the headlines were not positive. A lawsuit typically is not a positive sentiment. For lawyers, it's a very positive sentiment. For most of us, it's not positive. But yet, the emotional analysis of the text of those headlines, so not the sentiment was lawsuits and board of directors exiting, but the emotional contour, the shape of the emotionality of those words were kind of in between two extremes, joy and anger. When something is in between, kind of roughly in between two extremes, what might you say it actually is trying to do? I see somebody thinking about saying it but not saying it. What it's actually trying to do is trying to articulate neutrality. It's trying to articulate neutrality. What is neutrality except making everyone angry equally? That's essentially what it's trying to do. So if you look at those news headlines, you try and see a journalistic attempt at balancing an overall negative sentiment of topics with trying to be neutral in the emotionality of how they're expressing them. So that's the difference between emotional scoring and sentiment scoring. So where does this leave us? Well, I think it leaves us, we have to take a full circle back to Alan Turing and ask ourselves, now that we had a little bit of an introduction to NLP, to natural language processing sentiment analysis, are we at a place where we can say the machines are thinking in the terms of human thought and human language? I leave that for you. Maybe it's a yes, maybe it's a no. Yulia thinks it's probably a no. I leave that for all of you to articulate and to grapple with. I want to thank you so much for this time. You've all been so southernly hospitable. It is amazing. Walking down the street, I keep on checking for my wallet. Is it still there? You're all so friendly. And last but not least, I just leave you this resources page here, which some interesting things if you're interested in studying more about this. A book called Through the Language Glass, Why the World Looks Different in Other Languages by Guy Deutscher. And then this article, seminal article from the University of Chicago Press on polarity, so understanding the deep inner workings of how polarity is understood. And then the API references for the 3 APIs. And finally, the repo for this little application if you're interested in playing with it yourself. Thank you very much.